It was a stormy evening when Emma, a devoted single mother, packed her car with a homemade birthday cake and a small gift wrapped with care. She had driven 9 long hours across state lines to surprise her only son, whom she hadn't seen in over a year. Her heart raced with anticipation, imagining his face lighting up when he saw her at the door. But when she arrived and knocked, the door swung open, not to joy, but to silence and discomfort. Her son stood there, awkward, with his fiancée by his side. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "you shouldn't have come." That moment shattered everything Emma believed about the bond they once shared. Emma stood at the doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she held tightly onto the small gift box in her hands. The silver ribbon, slightly frayed from the anxious twisting of her fingers, trembled with her grasp. Inside was a watch, nothing extravagant, but carefully chosen, engraved with the words "To my son, always." She had imagined this moment for weeks, picturing the smile on his face, the embrace, perhaps even a tear of gratitude. But the scene before her was not the one she had hoped for. Her son stood across the room, surrounded by friends and decorations she hadn't known existed. Balloons floated lazily against the ceiling, and the air was filled with laughter until they saw her. The room fell quiet. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw the boy she used to cradle. But then his fiancée stepped forward, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression cool. She whispered something into his ear, and his face hardened. "Mom, you should have called first," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic but firm. Emma forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just wanted to surprise you. It's your birthday." Her voice was soft, but beneath it trembled years of distance and unspoken words. He hesitated, glanced again at his fiancée. "We're in the middle of something right now." Emma felt the weight of the moment press down on her. The gift in her hands suddenly felt heavy, unwanted. She looked past him, at the cake, the candles, the people who had taken the place she once held. She had been excluded, forgotten. A guest in a life she used to be the center of. "I won't stay long," she whispered, her throat tight. She extended the gift slowly, and when he hesitated before taking it, she withdrew it slightly, just enough to notice his pause. That was enough. Enough to realize that she no longer belonged. As Mia stepped onto the quiet street just outside the bookstore, the late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent. The sky had shifted from a bright cerulean to soft hues of peach and lavender, brushing the world with a fragile kind of beauty. But none of that reached Mia's heart. She pulled her coat tighter around her, not because she was cold, but because the heaviness inside her chest was spilling out, and she needed something, anything, to hold herself together. The footsteps behind her were soft at first. She might have ignored them if it weren't for the way her body seemed to recognize the rhythm before her mind did. A familiar cadence. Slow. Measured. Hesitant. Her breath caught, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. Mia turned. And there he was. Ethan. The man she had once imagined a life with, the man whose absence had hollowed out a part of her she never quite managed to refill. He looked almost the same, and yet, not at all. His hair was shorter than she remembered, his jaw lined with a faint trace of stubble, and his eyes, those deep, storm-colored eyes, looked tired, older. Like he'd been through his own private war. They stood like statues, only a few feet apart, separated by years of silence and oceans of unspoken words. "Mia," he finally said, his voice low and raw. The sound of her name on his lips was like a blade wrapped in silk. It stirred something in her she had tried to bury long ago. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Ethan swallowed, his throat moving with effort. "I didn't plan this. I didn't know you'd be here. I was walking past and saw you through the window. And I couldn't walk away. Not this time. Mia blinked, heart hammering. So many things she wanted to say rushed to the surface, accusations, confessions, pleas, but none made it past the tight knot in her throat. You shouldn't have come, she managed. I know, he said, eyes dropping to the ground for a second before meeting hers again. But I had to. There was a long silence. The kind that stretched and throbbed with everything unsaid. The wind picked up slightly, teasing strands of Mia's hair across her cheek. She didn't move. I hurt you, Ethan said. It wasn't a question, just a simple, brutal truth. Mia let out a bitter laugh. That's putting it lightly. I thought staying away would protect you. That I was doing the right thing by leaving. Don't you dare pretend it was noble, she snapped, the fire returning to her voice. You didn't leave to protect me, Ethan. You left because it was easier than facing what we had. Than fighting for it. He flinched like she'd struck him. You're right, he said softly. I was afraid. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of failing you. You already did, she whispered. Ethan stepped forward, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. Mia. I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day. Her heart wavered. Part of her wanted to believe him. To let herself sink into the warmth of his voice, the familiarity of his presence. But the other part, the scarred part, remembered every night she'd cried herself to sleep, every unanswered message, every promise that had turned to dust. You don't get to show up after all this time and just say you're sorry, she said, voice trembling. I know, he said. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I needed you to know. That I'm sorry. That I still. Don't, Mia interrupted. Don't say it. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, steadying himself. I don't expect anything from you. I swear. I just wanted a chance to look you in the eye and admit what I couldn't back then. She studied him. The sincerity in his voice. The remorse in his eyes. But also the longing. The faint glimmer of hope he hadn't fully extinguished. Mia felt something crack inside her. Not a break, exactly, but a shift. A loosening. I should hate you, she said. Maybe you do, he replied. They stood in silence again, the city moving around them like a ghost, cars passing, people walking, all unaware of the storm unfolding between two souls who had once been intertwined. I thought I was over you, Mia whispered, more to herself than to him. I never got over you, Ethan replied. The words hung there, suspended in the space between them. Mia turned away, staring down the street as if answers might lie in the distance. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I've changed. So have I, Ethan said. Maybe not enough. Maybe not in the ways that matter. But I'm trying. She looked back at him, eyes searching. Why now? Why come back at all? Because I couldn't live with the silence anymore. And I couldn't let myself die wondering what might have happened if I'd faced you. If I'd owned my mistakes. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the world. She blinked them back fiercely. And what now? I don't know, he admitted. I don't want to mess up your life again. I needed you to know that losing you was the biggest regret of my life. For the first time, Mia saw not just the man who had hurt her, but the man who had suffered too. The man who had wandered lost, like she had. Who carried his own shadows and guilt like stones in his pockets. She sighed, a long, weary exhale. I'm not sure I can forgive you. Not yet. That's okay, he said gently. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. Even if it means waiting forever. She met his gaze, and something inside her shifted again, slightly, cautiously. Like the first crack of spring thaw in a long winter. I don't know what this means, she said. Neither do I, Ethan replied. But maybe, it means something. Mia didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away slowly, each step heavy with uncertainty. But she didn't tell him to leave. She didn't shut the door completely. And as Ethan stood watching her go, he felt, for the first time in years, a small flicker of hope. A beginning. Or at least, the chance of one. The streets glistened beneath the dull orange glow of the street lamps, each puddle reflecting fractured pieces of a world that no longer made sense to Mia. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement as she walked, her coat clutched tightly around her. The cold wind slashed across her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Inside, there was a storm far more vicious than anything the weather could conjure. Ethan's voice still echoed in her ears. Not the gentle, teasing one she remembered from before, but the cold, controlled version she had just heard. He had looked at her like a stranger. Not with love, not even with anger, but with a distant indifference that cut deeper than any insult could. How had it come to this? She remembered the way they used to laugh, the kind of laughter that made your stomach ache and eyes water. She remembered his hand in hers, the comfort of his presence, the certainty she used to feel when he looked at her like she was the only person that mattered. But now, that warmth had vanished, replaced with silence and guarded words. Mia's footsteps slowed as she reached the bridge that overlooked the river, the water below dark and slow-moving. She leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the frosty air, trembling fingers brushing tears away from her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rewind time, to fix whatever had broken. But most of all, she wanted answers. What had changed in Ethan? Was it her? Had she pushed him away without realizing? Her mind raced through every memory, analyzing every conversation, every moment when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, or when he turned away too quickly. Guilt gnawed at her chest. Maybe she had been too distant, too focused on hiding her own fears. She had always believed she was protecting him by holding back her pain, but maybe, instead, she had built a wall he couldn't climb. Behind her, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Mia turned her face upward, raindrops falling softly against her skin. She let them fall, no umbrella, no shelter. Just her and the storm. And then, suddenly, a voice. Mia. She froze. The voice was low, tentative, familiar. Turning slowly, she saw Ethan standing a few steps behind her, his figure dimly illuminated by the flickering street lamp. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the world rested there. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. I didn't think you'd still be here, he said softly. I didn't think you'd come, she replied, her voice barely audible over the rain. He took a step closer, then paused. I didn't want to leave things like that. Mia looked away, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Then why did you? Ethan sighed, and for the first time that night, she saw the flicker of something real, something raw, pass across his face. Because I was scared, he admitted. Because I didn't know how to fix what was broken. And it was easier to pretend I didn't care than to face how much I did. Mia's breath caught. The rain was falling harder now, soaking them both, but neither moved. I thought I was losing you, she whispered. And I didn't know how to fight for you without losing myself. They stood there, two souls exposed in the rain, silence thick between them. Maybe, Ethan said, stepping closer, we both made mistakes. But I still care, Mia. I never stopped. Her walls trembled, but didn't fall. Then prove it, she said. Don't just say the words. Show me. Ethan's eyes held hers for a long moment before he nodded slowly. I will. The rain washed over them, cold and relentless, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Mia felt something stir in her chest, a flicker of hope. A fragile beginning. 6 months had passed since the door slammed shut behind Lan's last words, leaving only silence and a mother's regret hanging in the stale air of a house that no longer felt like home. In that time, the seasons had changed, the flowers outside the window had bloomed and withered, and life had stubbornly continued, as if indifferent to the wounds time refused to heal. Maya had learned to live in that silence. She moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps soft, her voice quieter still, as though afraid that any noise might awaken the pain buried in the corners of every room. She folded Lan's baby clothes again and again, those tiny onesies Lan had once touched with hope in her eyes. Sometimes, she found herself standing by the nursery door, hand trembling on the frame, wanting to step inside, wanting to believe there was still time. But each time, she turned away. It was easier to pretend that distance was the answer. That her silence wasn't another kind of cruelty. And then came the call. It was late afternoon, the light slanting golden across the tiled floor when the hospital rang. A calm voice, too calm, said the words that shattered her. Your daughter is in the ICU. Pregnancy complications. You should come immediately. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor, but Mai didn't hear it. Her heart pounded with a dull, suffocating thud. She couldn't breathe. Her body moved on instinct, grab the keys, forget the coat, ignore the tremble in her legs. Outside, the world spun while she sped through streets blurred with tears. When she reached the hospital, the sterile smell hit her like a wave of shame. She stood in the elevator alone, the hum of machinery mingling with her racing thoughts. What if it's too late? What if she never forgives me? What if? But none of those questions mattered now. Lan was in a private room. Pale. Fragile. Oxygen tubes framed her face like cruel reminders of mortality. Her belly was still round, a fragile promise nestled within a breaking body. Mai hesitated at the door. Her daughter looked so small beneath the hospital blankets, so unlike the fierce girl who had stood in their kitchen months ago with fire in her eyes and rebellion in her voice. A nurse exited quietly, offering Mai a nod. She's awake. But weak. Go gently. Gently. Yes, gently was all Mai had left to give. She stepped into the room, and for a moment, the world stopped. The beeping machines, the distant voices in the hallway, all fell away. All that existed was Lan. Her Lan. Lan turned her head slowly. Their eyes met. Not a word was spoken. Mai crossed the room in 3 hesitant steps. Her hands, once so firm in discipline, now shook as she reached out. She didn't know what to say, words felt useless, too sharp or too soft. So instead, she simply placed her hand over Lan's. It was a fragile gesture, but it carried the weight of 6 months of silence, of sleepless nights and whispered prayers. It was an apology. A plea. A mother's quiet scream for forgiveness. Lan's lips trembled. Her fingers closed slowly around her mother's hand, and something inside her cracked. The tears came without warning, first hers, then Mai's. They wept together, not in anguish alone but in the fragile, aching hope of something new. They didn't need to speak the words "I'm sorry." Not now. The way their hands held onto each other said everything. And in that quiet hospital room, for the first time in years, they listened, not with ears, but with hearts wide open. No defenses. No pride. Just the raw truth of love, bruised but not broken. I sat beside the bed for hours, her fingers never letting go. She stroked Lan's hair, her voice trembling as she whispered stories from Lan's childhood, stories they hadn't shared in years. Lan listened, her eyes closing, not to sleep but to feel every word. She could still remember those nights, her mother tucking her in, singing lullabies with a voice tired from work but warm with devotion. As the sun dipped beyond the horizon, casting soft golden light through the hospital window, I leaned forward and kissed Lan's forehead. I should have listened, she murmured, her voice thick with remorse. Not to your words, but to your silence. I should have seen how much you needed me to understand, not judge. Lan opened her eyes, tears still clinging to her lashes. I needed you to see me as I am, not who you wanted me to be. I see you now, I said. And I'm here. Outside, night fell quietly. Inside, something fragile and sacred began to heal. The sterile white walls of the hospital room were bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the curtains, casting golden shadows across the floor. I sat quietly beside Lan's bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound between them, a rhythm that seemed to echo the unspoken emotions filling the room. It had been days since Lan had given birth, and though her body was healing, the real wounds, those buried deep in the hearts of both women, were only just beginning to surface. I glanced at her daughter, now asleep, her face pale but peaceful. The baby lay swaddled in a bassinet near the bed, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. I stood slowly and walked over, peering down at the infant's face. A lump formed in her throat. This child, so small, so innocent, had arrived into a world marked by brokenness, but also by an unexpected, fragile hope. Turning back to Lan, I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently brushed a strand of hair from Lan's forehead. Lan stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a long moment, mother and daughter simply looked at each other. No words. Just silence. But in that silence, volumes were spoken. I was so afraid, Lan finally whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she had held in. I didn't know if you would come. I didn't know if I could do this alone. Mai's lips quivered. You were never truly alone, she said softly, her voice barely above a breath. I just didn't know how to reach you. I let my pride, my fear, build a wall between us. Lan's eyes welled with tears. I kept waiting for you to understand me. To see me. I see you now, Mai said, her voice firm, but laced with grief and regret. She sank into the chair beside the bed and took Lan's hand in hers. And I'm sorry. Not just for what happened, but for all the moments I chose silence when I should have chosen compassion. The words hung in the air, raw and trembling. Lan let out a shaky breath, the tears now flowing freely. I'm sorry too, she said. For pushing you away. For not trusting you to love me for who I am. Mai squeezed her hand. You don't need to apologize for living your truth. I just wish I had seen how brave you were instead of seeing only what I feared. For the first time in years, they weren't mother and daughter at war, they were two women who had walked through their own pain and somehow met again on the other side. And as Mai leaned forward and gently embraced Lan, the years of silence between them finally shattered. The baby stirred and let out a soft cry. Lan reached for her instinctively, and Mai helped her cradle the tiny bundle of new life. As Lan held her daughter close to her chest, Mai placed a protective hand over both of them. The circle, fractured for so long, was slowly mending. In the stillness of that room, with tears on their cheeks and a newborn in their arms, Mai and Lan discovered what they had almost lost, each other. There was still much to say, to rebuild, but for now, this was enough: a touch, a tear, a shared breath. And above all, a quiet, enduring love that, at last, found its way home. In that instant, Emma realized that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive where it's not welcome. She left the cake on the counter, kissed him on the cheek, and walked away with tears in her eyes, but her head held high. Sometimes, the hardest choice a parent can make is letting go. Healing doesn't always come from being embraced, it comes from finding strength in your own silence, and the courage to love yourself enough to say, enough.